My name is Average Joe, and I'm a proud geek with expertise in movies, superheroes, and animation.
My name is Beef Pork Ribs. I'm a fine repository of esoteric knowledge, which I suppose most people would qualify as geeky. Though I dabble in many fandoms, my main areas of expertise are anime, movies, and Belgian comics, with a strong recent insurgency of D&D.
Our mission is to bring nerd and geek culture to the masses
by sticking it all under the microscope.
Welcome to the Bat Jar Podcast.
Movies, comics, graphic novels, TV, cartoons, animation, nerds are geeks, entertainment culture. Hear it on the Bat Jar, Nerdy Pound. Nerds and geeks, come gather around the scene. Come and join us in the Bat Jar. Come and tune into Average Joe and his team. Lots of room here in the Bat Jar. When the newest nerdy news drops, these podcast pals put it under the scope. DC, Marvel, Disney, Star Wars, cinematic multiverses. Christmas Strangest franchise. Hear it on the Bat Jar, Nerdy Power.
Hello there, and welcome to the Bat Jar Podcast, where we put nerd and geek culture under the microscope.
Or, to steal what you were saying just before we started the podcast, we look at nerd and geek culture through God's eye.
Yeah, so this is historic in the sense that I think this is the first time we're looking at a mostly spiritual or mostly religious movie on the podcast, and it's also probably the earliest we've ever recorded an episode. So, and by earliest I mean time of the day. Like it's well, the sun has risen where I am, but I don't think it has where Beef Pork Ribs is.
Oh, it is definitely quite dark out here, but I strive in the darkness, much like Bane or Batman later in his life.
Yeah, so Beef Pork Ribs, what kind of nerdy or geeky things have you been up to since we met last week?
Other than watching Prince of Egypt, I had a conversation with my brother-in-law, because we have both, well, it's his fault that I did it, but we were both into Warhammer 40k, and I had not realized that the new edition had come out, and then he started telling me about everything that my army, the Necrons, got, and it looks like it's a real good addition for Necrons, and now I'm sad that I don't have several $100s to spend on miniatures.
Let's pretend I understood any of that, but I understand what Warhammer is, and I understand it's also very expensive. I think all I can say for myself is that I did indeed finish season 1 of Cobra Kai, and there's still a whole second season to go, and there's a third season that'll be coming out next year. And I really enjoy it. I'm sure other people might have bad things to say about it, but I'm really invested in all the characters, and it is a bit like a soap opera at times, but I just can't get enough of it.
Any advancements on Avatar? Because funny enough, after the episode, a couple of my friends told me they had started rewatching the series.
No, I have not made any more advancement in Avatar yet. But I did finish my teen romantic comedy Snafu. The final season aired this past fall, and the final episode aired last week. So that's a show I had been following. It had aired like many years ago, I think 2013, and it just now in 2020 got its third and final season out. And this shows you the end of the story that the original novels had. So I think the main character made the wrong choice, but that's just my opinion.
As is often the case in these kind of love and decision animes and mangas.
So yes, today we are here to discuss the Prince of Egypt because this was something someone contacted us on Facebook about, thinking we should review and talk about the Prince of Egypt. So Beef Pork Ribs, I admit that I don't think I saw this movie in the theaters, and I do remember seeing it as a kid, but it was definitely like on home video, like sometime after it was actually released, and it didn't, for I don't know why, but it didn't stay with us in the same way a lot of the Disney movies did.
I mean, it was riding off of the hot success of Ants for DreamWorks Studios, but that was a joke. Ants was not successful at all, even though it wasn't such a bad movie. But I think for myself, I didn't watch it when I was a kid. Partially because I mean I was quite young when it came out, and at the time I didn't speak any English, so we had to wait for like French releases of films on VHS to go see them or to be able to see them, and I just never got around to it, which I'm not sure why, because I know that my mother really likes that movie and has actually used it in catechesis classes and other contexts. So I think I saw it for the first time sometime in high school in a youth group and quite enjoyed it. Uh, I think it's what has created my bias for the villain song. Playing with the big boys now, still being my favorite song of the entire movie, but I guess we'll get more into that later.
And as you pointed out, this is a movie made by DreamWorks Animation, one of the very first movies they ever made from an animation perspective. The ants, I think, being the first, and it's kind of funny to think about through like the lens of history because the Prince of Egypt came out in 1998, the same year that we saw Mulan and A Bug's Life come out, and Ants. So you'd think, like, of those four movies that came out that year, in my mind, this is certainly the one that seems to be like of the highest quality in terms of story, production, cinematography, even, and yet it seems to be the one that's like not remembered nearly as much.
I think that also depends in what crowd, like definitely in the general opinion in popular culture. Yes, I entirely agree with you. Although I think it is starting with people being a lot more critical these days of animation as a medium. It is starting to kind of overcome ants. Um, though Bugs Life and Mulan are probably still far ahead of it. But also, I do know this from following certain weird YouTubers that do Disney movies slash animation slash musicals that apparently in the musical crowd, and I've confirmed this with friends of Mjornil who are also quite heavily involved in the more artistic community, it actually does have quite a big following as being quite well known for its songs and for being like a solid musical, like one of the few solid musicals about religion that isn't preachy.
Yeah, I think that's probably the one positive legacy of the Prince of Egypt is that in recent years it actually has gotten like a Broadway musical production version of it, which is usually a sign that something is successful. So I mean, good on them for that. But going back to DreamWorks, yeah, this was the first and really one of the only movies they ever made that were traditionally animated, or what we would call 2D animation. It was the first, and like I said, one of the few they ever did. I have fond memories of like the Road to El Dorado, and I remember seeing like the Sinbad movie with Brad Pitt in it. But for whatever reason, like I guess these movies were just this market or this style of animation just was never really popular enough to take off.
Quick side note, I was looking up like which movies they did, and apparently the only movie they ever did that lost money was Road to El Dorado, and that baffled my mind. I love that movie so much. I also quite enjoyed the Sinbad movie, but I was keenly aware that that one did not do very well. Road to El Dorado, I wasn't as aware because I always liked it, and I was like, well, it's Elton John with the music, it's a hilarious story. But yeah, but then you compare it to some of the things like Chicken Run, which made like 5 times as much as it cost to make. Which I do remember Chicken Run being iconic. But yes, The Prince of Egypt was beautifully 2D animated. I think that's probably one of the reasons why it sticks out as one of their out of the three that you named. Like I think that one sticks out because yeah, there was a lot of effort put into the cinematography for an animated film, and I think it definitely paid off.
I think there's also one called Spirit, like one of it's about a horse. I've never actually seen it though.
Oh, yes. My fiance is a horse girl. She's seen it. There's also an animated series. I thought it was terrible and pandering to horse girls, but, you know, that's my personal opinion of it.
Yeah, and DreamWorks, of course, they really made the pivot towards three-dimensional animated movies after the success of Shrek. And most of the, pretty much, yeah, every DreamWorks animated movie that's been made since then has stuck to the 3D model. So I find that a shame just because I actually, in a lot of cases, prefer 2D animation to 3D animation. I'm might be in a minority there, but that's my hot take there.
I'm not gonna like wholeheartedly agree with you, although I do like agree that there are a lot of examples of really good underrated 2D animation, especially coming out of Japan. Um, but even specifically for DreamWorks, when I think of Sinbad, Road to El Dorado, and Prince of Egypt, and I guess Joseph King of Dreams wasn't DreamWorks, but I really all of those movies have a very similar art style. I think it might be like one of the associate studios who did it. But anyways, the I did like the style that that studio had, and that wasn't quite Disney, and it was a little more realistic, but still animated and cartoon ish. And I kind of yeah, I think it's kind of a shame because it was I think that that style lended itself very well to telling stories that were a bit more serious. I think that and I've seen other renditions because growing up in a Catholic household, I've seen other animated renditions of the story of Moses or the story of Exodus or other religious stories, and I don't mean just Veggie Tales, but like it's refreshing to see a style that you know while still being animation, still allowing for some of the whimsy and some of the more awesome also cinematography you can have with animation, still has enough weight to it and realism to put across that these are kind of important stories or powerful stories. And I also find that, like, honestly, the best parts of Sinbad portray that very well as the song sequences and the subtle character animation of Road to El Dorado.
Yeah, you mentioned Joseph King of Dreams. That was intended to be like a spin-off of The Prince of Egypt. It is made by DreamWorks, but it was made as a direct-to-video movie, and it didn't do nearly as well business in that. Sort of was the beginning and the end of this DreamWorks biblical story franchise. I think they had intended to do many other stories like it, but they kind of stopped after one. So that just again speaks to the lack of longevity that the I hate to say like Prince of Egypt franchise has. um, we really can't talk about this movie without talking about a man named Jeffrey Katzenberg. Have you beef pork ribs in your life ever been encountered with the story of Jeffrey Katzenberg?
If he's the guy who separated from Disney, no, because that was with Pixar, wasn't it? I I may have, but I can't recall it quite uh, exactly. So you may as well tell me the story. Regale me with
Well,
the tale.
so listeners of the podcast who've been around for a while might remember that during our episode on The Lion King last year, we talked about how there was one guy working at Disney who was like one of their major producer people, and his name was Jeffrey Katzenberg, and he was kind of one of the big wigs who was running Disney at the time, was involved in making a lot of their movies. The Lion King was really like the last one he was a big part of before leaving Walt Disney for creative differences. He didn't agree with some of their decisions, and they weren't willing to go ahead in some of the things he was wanting to do. So he actually went off and helped found what is now called DreamWorks Pictures. And he like co-founded with Steven Spielberg and a third guy whose name I can't remember. And Jeffrey Katzenberg, of course, coming from an animation background, wanted to do animated stuff. And so, the rumor is that they made Ants just because they heard that Pixar was doing A Bug's Life. And there's a whole like tale about how these three guys were having dinner one night, and Jeffrey Katzenberg was really speaking about how he wanted to use the technique of animation to tell a story. He felt that animation had been turned into like a medium to tell stories for little kids, and he saw it more as like a technique for filmmaking. And he's like, I want to do like an Indiana Jones or like Terminator 2 story with animation. And Steven Spielberg looked at him and said, well, you should just do the Ten Commandments.
It's actually not very surprising to me. Like, I don't know. I think um, people who know, but like the amount of investment Spielberg had in animation, both like obviously he was instrumental on bringing like CGI to the mainstream, and to make it, an integral part of some of his movies. But also, like, he was, um, not directing but producing Animaniacs, as well as, I believe he was also involved with the spinoff of Looney Tunes that came kind of out of it, and he was definitely still involved with Freakazoid and Pinky and the Brain. And you know, it's not surprising to me that he would have been one of the people to encourage, working with this medium, and to kind of invest in that kind of a dream, that as animation as a way to, yeah, to tell stories rather than just a way to pander to children. And yeah, I mean, I don't know. We could talk about Prince of Egypt as a remake of the Ten Commandments, but I don't think that's a very accurate way to describe it, even if that was the inspiration for it. Because I mean, they're very different movies in a lot of way, and as great as Ralph Fiennes was as Ramses, Yul Brynner is Yul Brynner.
Yeah, it's kind of funny because apparently, while he was still working at Disney, Jeffrey Katzenberg was pitching to the Disney heads, like, let's do a remake of the Ten Commandments as one of our animated movies. And I guess he brought it up several times, and every time they were like, no, like that's not our thing, like that's just not what we're gonna do. And so I think for him, it was probably like a great sign of providence to have left Disney and then have somebody else suggest you should do Ten Commandments. So that was, all the motivation Jeffrey Katzenberg needed to put the Prince of Egypt into production. So we're gonna just talk about the movie in a general sense, and we're not like we'll probably spoil the movie, but you know what? It's like this is a movie that's not only is it 22 years old now, but it's also based on the Bible. So we can't really spoil anything for you.
Spoilers for the Bible. I like it.
So we're gonna talk about this movie in its entirety. If you haven't seen it before, you should definitely go watch it. That's the very short version of the episode, because we're not going to put any spoiler tags. We're just going to get right into talking about the Prince of Egypt. So, beef pork ribs, give us the Blu-ray case description for the Prince of Egypt.
From DreamWorks Pictures, prepare yourself for power,
I will not be the weak link.
for destiny,
Things cannot be as they were.
for miracles. Now is the time for the story that changed the world forever. The Prince of Egypt, rated PG, starts Friday, December 18th.
You've seen the Ten Commandments. You may have seen the vegetailed Wild West telling of the story, but never before have you seen the story of the Book of Exodus in so much color and songs and beauty.
So, to get us started here, I have a quote from Jeffrey Katzenberg. One of the things we decided when we took the decision to make the movie was that this was not our story. It is not a fairy tale that is simply taken and adapted to tell a version of it, or that serves as a theme or an allegory or something else that we would want to tell. From the very beginning, it was our goal and our mandate to make this Bible story and to be as faithful and accurate in our telling of it as we could be, in the context of understanding that we have 90 minutes to tell the story of 80 years of a man's life. So that forces us to make a lot of choices along the way, but we did not want those choices to do anything that would affect or change or diminish the essence of the message, the values of the story as it exists in the Bible.
Yeah, and I think that speaks also to the kind of, not a warning, but like there's a little text at the beginning of the movie that more or less says the same thing, that even though some artistic license had to be taken, artistic and historic license had to be taken, the goal of this movie was to be as respectful and accurate to, I think what they said is a story that is central to the faith of millions of people. And I think that definitely shines through in some of the little things, but also in the amount of effort that was clearly given. Like I think Prince of Egypt, like, it's kind of the standard these days for like biblical movies to have, some Hebrew words or songs or being completely, in Hebrew, or to add elements of, Jewish culture into them, which definitely in 1998, I mean, if you compare other movies that were coming out, even like, not to rag on it, but the original Mulan had a lot of very stereotyped kind of approach to it, and most other movies did, animated or not. Whereas this movie seemed to take a lot of its roots very seriously and clearly had gone through and done some research, both for like the songs that are coming out, the costumes, the way that the cultures were handled even was very different from other things coming out of it at the same time.
Yeah, apparently when they were making the movie, they went out of their way to consult biblical scholars and Jewish religious leaders and even some Muslim scholars, because acknowledging that the story of Moses is important to all of those Abrahamic religions, they wanted all their kind of, I don't know, I guess their sign off on the movie, and so they actually did make some changes after the different groups of people reviewed the movie. And to me that just shows again like that there was an intentional effort to be genuine and authentic, and to not just be like, inspired by true events.
Yeah, and as I said, my mother has taught religion classes and has used this movie to explain certain parts of the Bible, like not just the story of Moses, but to kind of help with a deep dive on Passover and why it was important, and as well as what kind of like the liberation from Egypt meant, and uh, also just the mentality. I mean, the opening song. We said no spoilers, so the opening song, "Deliver Us," is just such a powerful way to open the movie, and to kind of have that idea that, um, you know, that eventually goes to when God later on speaks to Moses and is like, "I've heard the cry of my people." It's like, yeah, we've heard it too, and it's we know what this is about. We know what the stakes are, and we've seen what the problems are.
So you said it wouldn't be a good idea to compare this to the Ten Commandments. I have never actually watched the whole entirety of the Ten Commandments. I've seen sections of it on when it's played on TV and whatnot. But I understand that movie's like 3 hours long, and it's got this. It's like it's considered one of like the most epic movies of all time, to the point where it hasn't really had a full on remake yet, even though it's over 60 years old. So maybe for those of us who are uninitiated, why would it be a bad idea to consider this a remake of the Ten Commandments?
I think first and foremost because the Ten Commandments is 3 hours long. Um, but also some of the things we talked about. The Ten Commandments was definitely looking at the Bible from a very Christian point of view. Did not have that many outside influences in it. It tried to cram as much as it could into it, and it was definitely a spectacular movie. Um, but it also it covers more of the story of Moses. It also decided to go, whereas the Prince of Egypt took the approach of showing the events, often in song montages, but in a way that works, and we can talk about that. The Ten Commandments really went through the length of showing a lot of the scenes much more uh, accurately to the direct text of Exodus, but also a lot more in length and in detail. Um, and I mean, yeah, it's a comparison that I think just does more harm to both movies than good, because you'll really quickly be saying things about how long the Ten Commandments is and how crazy that movie was, and then you'd say, well, how short Prince of Egypt is and what might be missing from it. Um, and of course, the Ten Commandments is not a musical; it's not an animated movie. It's very hard to kind of compare things from such a different medium, even though the basic story is the same.
I think for me, like story wise, like how the two films seem to really distinguish themselves is that The Prince of Egypt really seems to focus on the relationship between Moses and Ramesses as brothers, and like the fact that they grew up together, and so that when they are put into conflict with each other, it is like you actually feel the emotional weight of that. I saw a guy talk about the I saw a guy talk about the Ten Commandments, and he made a point of saying it's like if you didn't know that Moses and Ramses grew up together, the scenes where they interact as adults, it's as if you couldn't tell that they grew up as siblings.
Yeah, I agree that is a major difference, but also again does play to like if you read the Bible and what happens in Exodus, you wouldn't think that Moses and the Pharaoh grew up together or even in the same vicinity. Um, so, like, I do understand where that difference comes from, and it does give for a very kind of different kind of performance for those characters, which I think is another reason why it's not very fair to compare. Because I mean, I believe it was Charlton Heston. Yes, was a great Moses. I'm pretty sure, and Yul Brenner was a great Ramses, a great Pharaoh. I still like the mannerisms. So it shall be written, so it shall be done. Every time he says something, because he's the king of Egypt, he's the Pharaoh. Whatever he says becomes written. Whatever is written is law. Um, and so those are very good performances. But you're right; they don't really perform as people who really knew each other, or rather they perform as people who might have known each other but have grown so far apart that they cannot be reconciled. And I think even though Prince of Egypt kind of shows that there's a willingness on both sides of the brothers to reconcile, it doesn't take away from the immersion of the story. But I definitely find that the Ten Commandments portrays a Ramses that is a lot less likely to give in to demands because of the way he grew up and because of the man he is rather than the influences in his life. Um, which again is I think it's just a different character choice or a different aspect of the character to explore, which I think is no less good or valid than what the Prince of Egypt does.
Well, this is my thing. Observing the two films, it seems as though they're just very evocative of like movies that were made in their different time periods. Because like you have the Ten Commandments that was made in the 1950s. You have Charlton Heston as like this hero who he comes across as a leader and like a strong and confident individual even before he's put in a position of leadership, and so you can really believe in him as like a hero and as somebody that would lead a group of people. And that's very evocative of movie heroes of that time, is like you got these charismatic guys playing the parts, and just by their very like stature and the way they spoke, you could just tell that they were a hero and you identify with them as a hero. And then the way the Pharaoh is portrayed in the Ten Commandments, it's very much a villain, like through and through. He has like the way he looks, the way he stands, the way he speaks, the things he says. Like in the same way that Moses is so very clearly the hero, Ramesses is so very much clearly the villain of the movie. And even the way the movie portrays God is evocative of like how most Christians kind of saw God at that point in history. And then you contrast these three elements with the Prince of Egypt. You have effort taken to make Moses much more of an everyman, kind of like an ordinary person who's thrust into the role of being a leader. And of course, that's a lot of movies nowadays. That's generally the way they try and go about having a protagonist, someone that the audience can more so identify with. And then with Ramses, it's like he's much more sympathetic as a villain, and that seems to be something else we see in movies these days. Is we aren't just satisfied with having like a villain who's a villain anymore. We want an explanation as to why they're a villain, and like I guess rationalization for how they've gotten to the place they're in. And then even again, the way that God is portrayed is God's much more of of a loving personal God in the Prince of Egypt than he was in the Ten Commandments.
Well, I agree generally with everything you said. I would, I, I think, and maybe I am biased. I do love Yul Brynner as an actor, and his performance in that I think did still carry enough justification. Like, obviously, it's not the same level as sympathetic we see now. I totally agree with you, but I think it would be a little bit of a disservice to just have him as being a villain. Because yes, he definitely was more villainous, and he was, Yul Brynner kind of got typecast as a bigoted villain. You think of The King and I. I mean, he improves in The King and I. He doesn't really in the Ten Commandments, but he was kind of very sharp and very set in his ways. Same thing with his role in the movie Anastasia. He's very set in his way, very strict. But I think that there was like enough there in the Ten Commandments to make him understandable, if not sympathetic. Um, but I think that's probably enough on the comparison. You are right; they are very much movies of their time, especially movies based around religion of their time, while both being respectful and both striving for having a very good story and telling it properly. They do have big kind of different feelings.
I have here in my notes lots of compelling shots of big heads. And I think that's a comment on how the Prince of Egypt has a lot of very interesting just shots from like a filming perspective. And so there's often a lot of moments where like there's a close up on like maybe like a character's head while it's like semi transparent and there's like other things going on and you really, I don't know, to me it felt very cinematic. It felt very creative. It felt like this is actually not just a generic movie. This is actually like a piece of art that we're trying to create.
Okay, I said I was done comparing with the Ten Commandments, but I think this actually is one of the strengths that the Prince of Egypt does have over it. But it's also a strength of the Prince of Egypt as a movie generally is visual storytelling. Again, I kind of mentioned like there are some parts of stories that are told through video montage, um, but the amount of detail and effort that's put into some of them, and specifically Let My People Go, a lot of the shots that you're talking about are very cinematic, but also a lot of them were set up early in the movie. The shot of the throne room, um, where the pharaoh, so where the pharaoh, their father, is chastising them, and you see the big statue, the symbolic weight of the dynasty that he's talking about in the background, and that wide shot where you see people in the throne room and the giant head comes back a few different times. It comes back in Let My People Go, but it also comes back in the first encounter between Ramses and Moses, where this time Ramses is on the throne, Moses is standing away, and yeah, you have the head of their father, but then you have a bigger head of Ramses behind, and that was set up from the beginning to show, again, you were talking about making him sympathetic to show where this came from, what this whole kind of pigheadedness of his is built upon, and there's also there's other ways that this comes back, like he repeats the words of his father in that scene that they were only slaves, and which is the last thing that the pharaoh says to Moses before he runs off. And this movie definitely took a lot of effort into its cinematography and into um, not just having parallel shots, but having shots that tell a lot, which I think allowed for a shorter film, and B, having a few more lighthearted moments in between because the movie is so visually dense with information.
Yeah, I agree. The cinematography is incredible, and you really get the sense of the scope and the scale. And again, we said we were done comparing the Ten Commandments, but there are a lot of like big shots in that really show you scope and scale too. But the Prince of Egypt, because it's animated, can kind of do more with that. It can really be more creative with the camera. You know, like to get some of the shots that are in the Prince of Egypt, the Ten Commandments would have had to use like a crane or like a drone or like some kind of flying camera to get the same effect. Whereas one of the nice things about animated movies is that you can take the camera anywhere and you don't have to pay for any drones or any planes or whatever. You can literally like have these swooping shots and zooming in and out and showing you perspective in a way that you really can't. Again, you can't do that with live action. I will say of the animation though, to me, a lot of the 3D animation has not aged well. So they typically use 3D animation in this for objects and for like people and giant crowd scenes. And maybe I'm just too much of a nitpicker, but to me, I was like, there's only a handful of instances from the film I can recall where I thought the 3D animation was actually like quality stuff.
To that, I'd say yes, but I still think it was used sparingly enough that it didn't take you out. Like I found that other movies like Treasure Planet, like early movies who did this, like Treasure Planet or Sinbad, it kind of took you out of the movie. In Sinbad, at least, it was the supernatural thing, so it wasn't as bad. Um, I think the only scene where that's a bit of a detriment, perhaps, is the burning bush 3D animation. Um, like, not the scene in general, but specifically when you see the bush. Because the reflections and the cinematography of that scene generally, when you're seeing Moses, is amazing. But when you focus on the bush, it does seem a little bit. Yeah, it seems a little bit like the effect was, unfortunately reminiscent of the kind of effects they used to do the Kamehameha wave in the terrible live action Dragon Ball Evolution movie. So, but generally, I do think that, yeah, you're right. The 3D animation hasn't super aged well, but it was used sparingly and it wasn't taking away from the experience.
Yeah, and like they were pioneering for the time. At that point, it was really a novel thing to integrate three-dimensional animation into what was meant to be a 2D animated movie. So I won't fault them too much for it. It's just it certainly it affected my experience watching it again after these many years because I could clearly tell when something was actually like hand drawn and when something was done with a computer. And most of it's like hanging out in the background, but like, for example, it's like the scene with the wicker basket. It's like the basket is CG, the water CG, the boats are CG, and it just none of it looked overwhelmingly convincing. Let's talk about the music because they did indeed decide to go ahead and do this as a musical. Of course, I can't help but feel like Katzenberg was like just trying to follow Disney's kind of pattern of like, well, let's a lot of these movies are musicals, so let's do this as a musical. And if I'm being totally honest, like I literally just watched the movie yesterday, and like only a handful of the songs I can recall, and even the songs I can recall, it's like I'll remember like the chorus or like the one of the like the big line from the song. I'm not humming or thinking of the rest of the songs.
I think that, although that is true, I think that does speak to Katzenberg's vision again of it being something more serious. The music in Prince of Egypt, though not very catchy, um, other than perhaps playing with the big boys now, which is like one of my favorite villain songs out there, but it's it is music that is more cinematic, and it is a little bit less of a musical, but more like having music included in a movie. The distinction, of course, being that generally speaking, when you have musicals, it's when people are singing to express emotion instead of doing what they normally would, and usually it kind of takes you out to have the musical scene, which I don't like. Generally speaking, this movie had very little of. The music was to highlight some of the scenes or to move the story forward. It wasn't like, compared to Road to El Dorado, whenever they start singing in that, it starts getting a little crazier. And it starts, sometimes it's just montage, but sometimes you get, songs like "It's Good to Be a God," in which it goes completely crazy, which is more typical of what Disney films do, is, make it catchy rather than make it that big on what the like as big an impact on the story. Like, it's relevant to the story, but it isn't really moving it forward. It's Like at most, it's going to be a transition from point A to point B. Like Akuna Matata, yeah, it's a great song, but like it's really just a way to transition from kid Simba to adult Simba, and slightly inform on the reason why he doesn't want to leave, but it's not the reason he doesn't want to leave. We all know that. So I think that the music, um, although you could compare it to like kind of the Disney musical, I don't think that was the purpose. If anything, it was the purpose might have been to show that music can do other things. And again, yeah, you don't find yourself humming most of these songs, but I do know like people who have grown up with the movie. Like I know Mjolnir has watched it quite a bit when she was younger. Like she hums along with them, and they have stayed with her. So I think there is. It's just it's less pop song catchy and uh, more kind of thing that might stick with you. And especially, and I do think that like again, let my people go, but deliver us is just such a strong like even though the melody doesn't stick with you, the message of us of it sticks with you for the rest of the movie and establishes the stake much better than maybe something catchier might have been able to do.
That's fair. I'll concede. I don't know. To me, yeah, I guess, and that's maybe I shouldn't call it a musical, because to me, for a musical to be a good musical, I have to be able to walk away from it like humming at least a couple of the songs and wanting to go back and listen to them again. And frankly, I do want to listen to this music again. It's Well, first of all, the score is done by Hans Zimmer, and like he's one of the great film composers of the day. And the one song about miracles did indeed win the Oscar for best original song, which means that Be a Man never had a chance because they had this to compete with.
I think it's yeah, like it's the difference between a score and a soundtrack, and this was a lot more of a score than a soundtrack, and I think that just played to the strength of the film. Whereas, yeah, most of the other like movies, it's like you get the soundtrack, and there is a difference. Like there are a lot of things that I listen to, like I tend to listen to and make my students when they're doing work listen to scores either of movies or video games. Uh, so as opposed to like soundtracks, so I use games that have kind of like background music if I'm using a game, as opposed to like playing, you know, music from Ocarina of Time, which is a lot more upbeat because it's like different songs together. And I think that's the thing is like, yeah, like you said, this is the kind of music you want to listen to again, but not necessarily to sing along or to have fun, but like music you want to have an experience of again rather than just uh, enjoy randomly.
And again, I don't know if I'm just because I'm like such a huge fan of the Lion King, but I was getting some Lion King vibes watching The Prince of Egypt, and I had a couple different thoughts. I'm like, okay, well, Jeffrey Katzenberg was involved with both. Hans Zimmer's doing the music for both. There are moments where the music sounds kind of similar. And then it dawned on me, it's like, well, perhaps in some ways the story of the Lion King is also like the story of Moses, and I just never made that connection. But because now I'm in some ways more familiar with the story of the Lion King, I'm seeing the story of Moses as being like the Lion King, which of course I know that's not possible. But you definitely feel it towards the start of the movie when you got this like kid who's like this prince, and then something bad happens, and then he like runs out of town, and then he comes back later, and like the dynamic's not exactly the same, but do you know what I mean? Do you feel that same kind of similarity?
I see enough of it to grant you that. I mean, I also, people do talk about how Lion King is based off of Hamlet, and so the death of his father is definitely more important than um, it is to Moses. But it does have, you're right, it does have this kind of like exiled prince coming back for a different purpose and struggling a little bit, dealing with his past. I see it. I think there's enough there. The other thing, I said this in our little chat, but I'm going to say it here as well. Um, Choice of voice actors um, that are not necessarily like traditionally voice actors, but that were actual actors. Like, I feel like a lot of movies before the Disney Renaissance didn't really do that. Like the people who were the voices of animated characters were professional voice actors or people who didn't have the same kind of clot as the people that you had voicing the characters for Lion King or Prince of Egypt. And I don't know, unless you had something else to say about or more to say about the music, that could also be a good next subject to jump on.
Yeah, it's interesting because a lot of the actors in the Prince of Egypt, like there's some voice actors or some actors, I should say, like they get hired because they sound like themselves. So like if you hire Angelina Jolie or Jack Black, you're hiring them because they sound like those people, or even like Will Smith. But with some of the actors that are in this, like Val Kilmer or Helen Mirren or Sandra Bullock, you can't really tell it's them unless you know it's them. And that means that they can be very convincing as a voice actor. Like they're not being hired to play themselves in a sense. They're not being hired to just read the script as what people perceive like Will Smith to be. Val Kilmer is actually like acting in the role of Moses in this film.
Yeah, and like I think honestly, I remember because I did remember some of the voice actors in the movie, and we kind of joked about it last week on the podcast. But I had never realized that Aaron was voiced by um,
Uh, uh,
Jeff
uh,
Goldblum. Yes, that's why I hesitated. It's a Jeff Goldblum thing to do. Jeff Goldblum. Uh, yeah, and like, and yeah, some of the other ones like Michelle Pfeiffer didn't really take me out, and I didn't hear Michelle Pfeiffer. The only actors I really heard kind of were Patrick Stewart and Ralph Fiennes, but like much more Ralph Fiennes. But then again, you did hire an Irish guy to play a pharaoh. That one was a little interesting, but at the same time, I think he's still like his accent came out a little bit, but I do think that he was genuinely also doing um, a great job at being the character. And I think it added a level of kind of depth to Ramses that, you know, giving him a voice of a more dramatic tone helped to make him more than just, the spoiled prince he appeared to be, and also helped when he transitioning to him as a pharaoh already being kind of firm and strong in what he's doing.
Yeah, just on a personal side note, I find it funny all the Batman connections that come through here because, of course, Val Kilmer, who plays Moses, played Batman in Batman Forever, and then his character gets married to I can't remember her name, but Moses' wife, played by Michelle Pfeiffer, who, of course, played Catwoman. So you have a situation where Batman and Catwoman are married to each other, even though it's not the Batman that was in the movie with that Catwoman. And then, interesting enough, when they did do the Joseph spinoff, who voices Joseph? Ben Affleck. Why not? I think we should just make this a franchise of like Batman characters playing biblical characters. I would certainly pay for that.
I
Um,
mean, there are some, especially if you consider the amount of animated show DC has done, and specifically around Batman and Batman the Animated Series, I'd be down. And you've had great actors play Batman and Batman villains. So I mean, you could you could have Arnold Schwarzenegger. No, but you could have Mark Hamill. You could have all the different actors who played Batman as well. Like some of them have done some pretty good voice work as well. So I'm not against that. I think we should petition for more biblical movies, including Batman actors.
some of these characters aren't in the movie very much. Like Danny Glover is Jethro, and he's in like really like kind of like one segment, and then he's like removed from the rest of the movie. And again, they only have so much time to tell this story, and so some of these characters are naturally gonna have smaller parts. But I don't know. Did you feel like you were missing something by like only seeing so much of these characters?
I, in the particular case you gave, he does get a song, which was pretty good. I don't think so. Like honestly, I was surprised rewatching it at how quickly the story went by and how little dialogue there was compared to what I was remembering. It had been a while since I watched it. but I never got a feeling that the film was lacking for it. Um, and again, I think that has a lot to do with very good visual storytelling. Like, you don't need to have as much dialogue if you don't have exposition and if you are showing, not telling, which this movie does a very good job at doing, which is ultimately one of the strengths of animation as a medium, is that you can put a lot more things into a shot, and the eye can register more out of a drawing than the camera can out of movement. I don't know if that makes sense, but like basically animation, you can make actions take less frames than they would when you're filming traditionally, but the human eye can still identify all those things. And that's part of what makes kind of like these kinds of movie great, is that there is a lot of visual information, but not so much that it's overwhelming, but more that you could put like in another kind of movie. And you talked about it with like the tracking, the CGI tracking shots that would need like a helicopter or a drone to film. Even with a helicopter or a drone, um, you wouldn't be able to register as many actions that are happening as fast. So it's I started rambling about animation. I'm sorry, but it is something that does play to the film's strength and does make it so that whatever is lacking in dialogue gets made up in other ways.
Yeah, and that actually brings up. We talked about the visual storytelling, but there's lots of moments where you just see like I think of the moment when Moses tells his wife about seeing God and how that is all communicated through the music and through his body language. Like you don't hear anything he's saying, but you can see the way that the two are interacting with each other, and then it's this big significant thing that's happened. And so yeah, like Michelle Pfeiffer's character doesn't actually have a lot of dialogue in the movie. She's in the movie a lot. She's there, but often like what she's her role or what she's communicating is done non-verbally, which again is atypical, I would say, for a movie in this kind of style or genre.
And I think that's even telling of what they were trying to do, even with like the villains, because it's Steve Martin, Martin Short, who play the high priests, and you know, this movie again followed the Disney formula of having comic actors be either like villains or comic relief characters, but it wasn't to the point where they were overused and where they felt comically out of place, like Mushu, or some other characters. Like even much as I know you love Hercules, but Danny DeVito does seem a little bit out of place at times in that movie. And so this, by not having so much dialogue and not, overindulging the comic actors as comic relief, I think was beneficial to the story and helped to keep a good tone with it while still making good use. Like there are a few jokes that the high priest give, and the comedic timing is great, and the two actors worked really well together to have that little kind of chemistry between those two very minor characters who say very little but who are still able to come across as what they are supposed to be, kind of conniving, a little bit cowardly, definitely charlatans that are trying to keep the pharaoh happy by pretending to represent the gods.
Yeah, I don't know. I've heard people kind of wish that those characters weren't in the movie, feeling they were out of place. But you know, you can't make everybody happy.
I'm just going to make a quick argument against that because, well, okay, because first off, the priests of the pharaoh are definitely in the Bible and are an important part of um, the kind of miracle, the plagues of Egypt being countered by um, Pharaoh, and they do give credence in the movie to Ramesses' kind of idea that no, this god isn't that much. Our gods can do this, which I think is really important because, and this is kind of a little bit more on the religious symbolism of it, but the plagues of Egypt are supposed to be supposed to represent the power of God over the Egyptian gods. And each of the plague is kind of countering something one of the major gods of the Egyptian pantheon was in charge of and was supposed to protect Egypt from, ending with, death. And at the time, the greatest um, Egyptian deity was Osiris, who had power over life and death. And just before that, the sun was blackened and Ra, the god of the sun, was the second most important deity. And so to have, I think, like, yeah, I can see the argument about maybe making them a little bit, having them have a bit less of a role, especially at the beginning of the movie. I could see that, but I think that it's very important to have representatives of the Egyptian gods in the movie, both to validate Ramses' confidence as himself as the rising and setting star, as well as to kind of put the weight of what was happening not just physically in Egypt, but to kind of like the faith of the people of Egypt was being shaken by the plagues.
So I had a thought while watching The Prince of Egypt. It almost appears as if they present Miriam as the real hero of the story, because it's through her persistence and like pursuing Moses that even when her brothers like trying to hold her back and tell her to stop, it's like because of her reaching out to him and being like, "You're our brother." Like really, the whole series of events kind of comes into place, and then even later on in the movie when he feels like dejected, defeated, she essentially is there to like provide comfort and support him and say like, we I believe in you, we believe in you. And it's interesting because again, it I don't know, I don't know the story of Exodus super well. I don't know how important Miriam is to the story, but certainly watching the movie, I was like, she is a very important part of this. Like if she were to be taken out of the movie, like this wouldn't have happened the way it happened.
Yeah, I mean, as far as like her place in Exodus, I mean, she is called a prophet, so it's not like she was of no importance. She was most likely a woman of spiritual guidance for the people as well. So there is some things that do indicate towards that, but no, I hadn't. I hadn't actually thought of that. But it is true that she's the catalyst for most of what does end up happening to Moses. But paradoxically ends up having a slightly smaller role because in the story of Exodus, she goes up to the Pharaoh's daughter, not wife, but still, who finds Moses and is like, "Oh, I know a wet nurse," and that's why Moses' mom ends up being his wet nurse. But that would have been a lot to add into the movie, and I think didn't need to. Um, but it did, yeah, it did kind of bring her role in a different way. And I think it does take. I don't think it changes the story because she's still, again, she's kind of inspired to do this, and it's still, you can say part of God's will for her to have talked to Moses as opposed to it being like, oh, I accidentally kill somebody, I'm going to run forever. And I think it definitely, her existence and her telling Moses about who he was added to the weight of things because, like, yeah, and it helped, I think, again, to make it about the character of Moses, the character of Ramses, as opposed to just the story of Exodus. Because had he not had that conversation with her and had those doubts, you're right, it wouldn't have played out. If he probably wouldn't have killed the guy accidentally, and even if he had, he probably been like, "Oh yeah, Ramses is right. We're just gonna write this off. He's the pharaoh, or going to be. Who cares what I do?" So yeah, uh, I I hadn't thought of that.
This is just a little note I also wrote when I was watching the movie. They dropped the title a lot. Like there's at least 5 or 6 times where he mentions, "I'm a prince of Egypt. I was the prince of Egypt." And to me, it was like, come on, movie, you're smarter than this. You don't need to keep throwing the title at us. We get what you're trying to illustrate here.
Yeah, it was a little bit of pandering, which I was actually surprised too at how many times they actually said the words Prince of Egypt, especially because I mean I'm pretty sure that wasn't really a thing, like a real title, to be the Prince of Egypt, but it was. There are not that many faults I can attribute to that movie. So yes, it's not a perfect movie, but it does do very well.
One touch, and I think we can kind of start to wrap up here. One touch I really appreciated is how they portray God and how they chose to give like the voice of God to the person who's listening to God, because you can read into that a lot, but certainly for anybody who is a Christian or who does like pray to the God that's portrayed in this movie, often like yeah, you do hear God speak to you in your own voice, and it's not like some other, it's not Morgan Freeman or some other voice speaking to you. You hear him through your own voice, and I thought that was a very clever, poetic, like great way to portray God. And certainly as a Catholic myself, that is certainly how I like see God or perceive God. And I don't know, to me, it's like to see that portrayed in a big budget Hollywood movie, even though it's one of the older ones now, it still was something validating and nice to see.
Yeah, and I think it also speaks to Val Kilmer being not just his voice, but a good voice actor in this movie, because there is enough difference that you don't necessarily immediately figure it out, um, which is good. But also, um, it was nice to have a voice, yeah, that isn't purely recognizable, and that did have a lot of modulation to it, which I think was very good. It also very Old Testament-y, where God shows a lot more emotion when he speaks to people.
So, I mean, final thoughts. This is a great movie, and I would say I'm very disappointed that this never led to like more of a franchise or more movies like this, telling stories from the Bible in like a very epic musical way. It's interesting that it was received well enough that I guess the Joseph thing got put into production, but it never it never manifested anything beyond that. So it is kind of an interesting kind of question, like why is the Prince of Egypt kind of like a one of a kind, or why aren't there more movies like it now, and like why isn't it remembered as fondly? Because it's like to me it's like the Iron Giant. It's one of those movies that people actually, it's not like the Iron Giant, it's the opposite. It was successful when it came out, and now people don't talk about it. And Iron Giant wasn't successful when it came out, now people talk about it. So all I'm saying, people, you should watch The Prince of Egypt. I'd give it a solid 3.4 out of 5. Oh, not a 5. What am I doing? 3.4 out of 4 bad cookies.
Yeah, the only thing I could speak to is, for it not starting a franchise, religious movies are always difficult and always get a little bit of controversy and can be very hard to do. But also, I feel like if it was really his passion project to do the Ten Commandments as an animated movie and not necessarily to have, the religious stories portrayed, it does make sense that it wasn't something that spun on more of a franchise. But yeah, a very solid movie. I think people definitely should talk about it more, and even just as a piece of art, like as a piece of animation or as a musical, as integration of music into movies, it has a lot of value beyond the religious and spiritual. Um, and I think it also, like we talked, I kind of touched on it. It's one of the good examples of like something that's religious that isn't preachy, but that is still respectful, without kind of pushing religion. And I think that the world needs more of that for sure. So yeah, I think uh, I think I can give this movie honestly a 3.5 out of 4. There are a few things that could be better, but not a whole lot. And so yeah, solid movie. You all should watch it.
And The Prince of Egypt is available on all, well, you can't, I couldn't find it on any streaming platforms. I actually had to rent it from YouTube, but it's available. Go buy it or watch it. Who knows? Whatever.
I've had it on DVD for at least 7 years, so I don't really have that problem.
So now it's time to go into the bat jar and look at our mail. This week we have an email from John Boskell that is subject line. It just says suggestions. So I think he's going to offer some suggestions. I'm not sure. There's no greeting. It literally just says movie dash Apollo 13 and 13 minutes. BBC World News podcast. Season 2 is Apollo 13. And then that's it. That's the whole email. So
I
I
like it.
I think he's suggesting we do an episode on Apollo 13, and perhaps like there's an additional BBC podcast that talks about Apollo 13.
I'm going to assume that's the case. I mean, there is I believe there's also a movie on Apollo 13. I'm not certain.
Yeah, that's one with Tom Hanks, right?
Yeah, that's interesting. I have never seen
I've
it,
never
but
seen it either. Yeah.
I mean, hey, we can space movies are geeky and nerdy, right? We can it is well into our purview, but we might end up comparing it to Gravity or something like that.
I haven't seen that one either, but I'm starting the habit of actually like writing these things into the batch jar as soon as we get it, because I find I often forget, and that's Apollo 13. Okay, that's
We
written
at the
down now.
Bat Jar Podcast do appreciate your suggestions and are doing our best to remember them and honor them.
So, if you, like John, want to get a hold of us, we can tell you how to do that.
If you want to reach the show, you can send us an email at,
batjarpodcast@gmail.com.
or you can tweet us at.
The Bat Cookie Jar.
You can find the Bat Jar Podcast wherever you listen to podcasts, including YouTube, because we got a channel. Share our posts on Facebook, write reviews, give our shows a rating. This will help all people join us inside the Bat Jar, and we appreciate it dearly.
And now it's time to go inside the bat jar and pull out a topic for next time. Beef pork ribs. This is the moment really where I miss recording in person, because I hate being the guy pulling things out of the jar and doing it all by myself over here. Maybe I should ship the Bat Jar podcast, like the actual Bat Jar, to you, and you can just be the guardian of the Bat Jar.
I mean, if you want to, that is a possibility, but cookie jars don't usually travel very well.
All right, what do we got here? Okay, I just pulled The Expanse out of the Bat Jar. This is a show that's on Amazon Prime, I believe. Is based on a novel series. I believe Andrew Taylor was the one who emailed us about this.
It looks like it also takes place in space, so that could be interesting.
Very good. Well, there you go. So come back to the Bad Chart podcast next week. We talk about The Expanse.
I won't promise to watch all 4 seasons.
Neither will I. And until that time, I'm Average Joe.
I'm Beef Pork Ribs.
Catch you on the flip side.
And remember to play with the big boys if you dare.